Okay, we're getting ready to start the mixing of our Param 5500 self-leveling overlay cement. A couple of key factors to consider prior to mixing. The mixing paddle really influences how this type of material mixes. This is what's referred to as a helical style mixing paddle. Unfortunately, this is a single style, so if you're mixing an overlay cement like we're about to mix the 5500, you want to use a dual helical style mixing paddle. What we're going to use for today's demonstration is what's referred to as a Jiffy style mixing paddle. Basically, you can see this bows, and this bow really conforms to the configuration of the side of the bucket. So this is really key for mixing this type of overlay cement in a bucket like this. Speaking of the bucket, it's important to pre-wet the bucket. I call it preconditioning the bucket. And what I mean by that is we'll just take a water hose and mist the inside of the bucket and turn the bucket over to get rid of that residual water. Now you wouldn't think so, but this heavy gauge plastic will still absorb some water. And we don't want, when we start mixing, we don't want the bucket, at least on the first batch, to absorb the mixed water from the actual mix. Also, you'll notice on these buckets, it has some depressions in the bottom of the bucket, and those are actually handles. So if your mixing partner is on the other side and you mix a batch, it's easy to go ahead and pour so you have something to grab onto. But what unfortunately happens on the inside of this bucket, there's a protrusion in the bucket, meaning this part that's recessed sticks up on the inside of the bucket, and sometimes you'll get some dry cement powder that doesn't thoroughly mix. So what we've done through the years is if we're doing an epoxy job, for example, we'll just take some of the leftover epoxy and we'll dump it right in the bottom of the bucket. In essence, what that does is it's creating a nice level base on the bottom, and it really helps for good clean mixing. All right, before we start, let's talk about some of the site conditions that affect the mixing of the Param 5500. Anytime you're working with a cement-based product, please keep in mind that cement-based products react or set up much faster in heat, okay? So if you are working in the summer conditions, perhaps you have to set up the mixing station. This is our mixing station here. We have a tarp. We're trying to keep everything clean. If you have to set up the mixing station outside, for example, the last thing you want to do is do it in the direct sunlight. As the material absorbs the heat, and especially if your mixed water absorbs the heat, it's going to set much, much quicker. So in addition to that, what we'll do sometimes is we'll chill the water. We'll actually take a 55-gallon drum or a large garbage can and fill it with ice. Keep the ice in the bags. You don't want to have chunks of ice certainly going into your mix. You'd be surprised how much that will extend your working time when it comes to mixing these materials. So keep everything nice and cool. Mix ratios on Param 5500. We're somewhere in the vicinity of about 5.5 quarts of clean, cool water up to about 5 3/4 quarts. Once again, please understand, temperatures will influence that mix ratio. So always start off on the lower end of that mix ratio. Don't just assume because it says it on the side of the bag, immediately go to the higher side, which is the 5 3/4 side. You can always add water to the mix, but once you've got it mixing, you can't take it back out, okay? So you need to also work smart when using these types of materials and consider when lifting. So when we take a bag and times 2 plus the water, we're looking at weights that exceed 120 pounds plus. So logic tells you you're not just going to try to pick this up. So what we'll do is we have little carts that we can wheel the material to. So this is just simply a furniture cart that they roll around appliances, and so once it's mixed, we'll put it up here, and one person can easily cart off the material to your final destination. So work smart. Last thing before we get going, you want to mix for about 3 minutes, okay? A lot of people will try to cut corners and maybe mix for 1 to 2 minutes and then wonder why they get pinholing or bubbles out there. So this type of material really requires shearing of the material. So that means you have to thoroughly mix it. And we're about to get started. You notice that both Brian and I have dust respirators. The airborne dust particulate is very harmful to breathe. So at a bare minimum, you want to protect yourself and wear the proper respirator. So in this bucket, we're going to be mixing 2 bags. And Brian has 5.5 quarts times 2, which is basically 11 quarts of water. And we're ready to get going here. Another common mistake I'll see applicators make is they want to do this. They want to go up and down with the drill paddle, and what that does is that actually entrains air into the mix. So you want to really keep the drill paddle submerged. Also, we're going to tilt this bucket so you can see. I want you to notice the vortex. A real easy way to find out if the water's or if the mix is overwatered, just adjacent to the vortex of this material, if you see a little bubble forming that's, say, maybe 1/8 of an inch or less, or up to 1/4 inch or less, that's fine. But when you see that bubble start to get you know, a quarter size or a half dollar size, that's an indication that you've overwatered the mix. So let's see what we can do here. Here's the vortex I'm talking about. And the fact that we don't see any bubble right here is an indicator that this is a good mix. If you see a little bubble form, typically that's going to be overwatered. All right, this is our first batch, 2 bags of the Param 5500. We've mixed for just over 3 minutes. It's time to cart this off to its final destination, and then we're going to have Brian go ahead and make up the last batch so we can install our 5500. All right, we're about ready to start the installation of our Param 5500 self-leveling overlay cement. We have our first batch here ready to go. Just wanted to run through a couple of tools. This is what we refer to as a gauge rake. There's many different styles of gauge rakes, as you can see here. This is called a cam style gauge rake. Basically, whatever the depth that's set is the material flows underneath. For our application today, I like this style right here because the rails that you see right here tend to not scratch our primer. They ride on top of it. So when you're using this gauge rake, you need to maintain the right pitch. Don't do this because it changes the elevation. Don't do this. You want to keep it more or less level and gauge rake at all times in this fashion. After the gauge rake, you have what's called a smoothing paddle. And a smoothing paddle comes in many different configurations as well. This is a traditional style smoothing paddle. Basically what you're trying to do is level the surface, but primarily what the smoothing paddle does is it breaks the surface tension and allows any entrapped air to pop basically. This happens to be probably my favorite style of smoothing paddle, and you see the edges are rounded. And what that does is by having the rounded edges, it allows me to feather edge, and I found that it leaves less smoother lines than something that's sharp or rigid like this. Something that's relatively new that the guys really like is eliminating the need for a smoothing paddle, and they use a roller. This is a customized roller that's been developed specifically for self-leveling cements. And it's really a nice addition to the industry because in essence you eliminate any smoothing paddle ridge lines or trowel lines. So we'll demonstrate on our Param 5500 the use of this roller. All right, before we get started, I have to use some elevated shoes. You'll notice on these shoes right here, anytime I get a new set of shoes, the first thing I do is I take a grinder and I grind them all flush and level. I don't want any points on my spikes. Here's a brand new set, for example, and you can see these points. It comes very sharp. I mean, that's absolutely very sharp. So you do not want this type of a scenario, regardless of the type primer that you're using, because when you go through and you stand on it, the weight is going to puncture through the primer, and oftentimes I'll see outgassing bubbles, and applicators will ask me, why is this occurring? And more often than not, it's because this sharp spike has punctured through your primer, and the material is trying to absorb down that, and it's allowing air to escape out of the concrete. So just give me a second here. I'm going to put my shoes on, and then we're going to go ahead and install our Param 5500. I mentioned earlier about working smart. Obviously, this is where a good example. I wouldn't try to lift this by myself. Now, typically, we'll talk about how many people should be required for a specific square footage in a moment. But here by myself, I'm just going to dump the material over. Now, I haven't lifted anything yet. So I've de-weighted the bucket, and when I get towards the end of the bucket, now it's much lighter, and then I'm able to go ahead and dump. So I haven't strained my back. Now, my key factor here is I just want to get the material into place. I'll dump a little bit more. Get out here in the material. Now, oftentimes I'll use the gauge rake as a squeegee. I'll lift up the edge to get right into the corner here. See this? Right into the corner. So once I have the material more or less dispersed to where I want it, then as a last gauge rake, I'm going to come back this way, making sure I don't have any voids. I have consistent material flowing underneath the gauge rake like we have here. Then I'll continue with this wave coming this way.